Now, today we are very lucky to have special guest, Dr. Richard Norman, with us out from Ontario, so he's a few hours ahead of us. Dr. Norman is a researcher, lecturer, futurist, and strategic consultant whose work aims to effect change towards a more socially just, sustainable, and resilient future. His work focuses on the lived experiences of people who have been marginalized in our society. Richard's research is committed to approaches that open up discourse and dialogue and work towards a more humane and morally driven worldview. His commitment to research continues with his most recent work, the Sport, Diversity, and Race Project, which is a postdoctoral fellowship led by Dr. Norman in collaboration with the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Norman for his presentation today, and I will stop sharing this screen so that you have everything you need.
All right, thanks so much, Courtney. Appreciate you all showing up today to listen to my talk. I thought what we'd do is I would talk at you for a little while, and hopefully it will generate some discussion and questions. I'd love to hear your views on what my research is looking at, and a lot of these timely kinds of topics seem to be ever present in the world of sport today. So I'm hoping that we can learn from each other as well. All right, so I'm going to begin. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate your time and attention as I move through some of my thoughts about sport and the notions of equity and inclusion. My scholarship forms through and an extension of myself, my multiple identities, constructions, and formations. I cannot remove myself from the work that I do. Perhaps none of us really can. And in fact, to do so, is that not the personification of privilege? But more importantly, I do so with the awareness of its implications. I seek to disrupt, trouble, tease out, and reform those pathways to knowledge that we covet, and project a resolute, devoid of change. I believe in praxis, the deconstruction, theorization, and reconstruction through action, all to be challenged and dismantled again. I step into my research through storytelling, narratives, forming the devices of interrogation. I speak today about the role of question. I speak not with a definitive proof offered by an expert testimony, but rather opinions about, or theories concerning, or insights suggested. I center myself in the question as it folds back upon itself over and over again. So to begin, let me tell you a story. It's a beautiful day in Vancouver, sunny and warm, as I make my way down the road to the gate. There's a breeze bringing the saltiness from the ocean to my nose. There's anticipation today, tournament day, my first. I took up tennis in my adult life, but sport has always been a constant. I was never very far removed. It infects and infests, leaving me to consider, do I know myself without it? Walking upon the pathway, I'm greeted with the majesty that is the club. To get to the structure, one needs to pass through perfectly crafted blue and green courts. You see, it is a special place, this. At least that's what everyone tells me. I get checked in and try to locate the change room. Being a guest, I look like a lost sheep or perhaps a sacrificial lamb. The members pay little attention. It is a yearly event, a disruption, an anomaly, an inconvenience to let them play. But the tone has been set. In fact, it is long established, because in this place, conformity is not an expectation, it is a requirement, even to be places on the periphery as a guest. Even though I knew beforehand, I put on my socks, shorts, shoes, and shirt. The reflection back of the hue disquiets me, because in this special place, wearing white was mandatory. Looking at myself in the mirror, and reflecting back at me through my mind's eye today, I see myself but a reflection only, wearing a costume. I was able to compete, to belong in that place for an instant, but at what cost? What lasting impact did that have for me? Why was this required and not all Black? And this sets the question in my mind: what is diversity? Inclusion into what? And equity for whom? These are questions we must ask ourselves in looking at the role of sport in its creation of the structures that uphold a particular set of values, tradition, and symbols. But to even enter into that conversation, we need to interrogate our understandings not only of sport as a cultural phenomenon, but also the very fabric of what we situate ourselves in today in this nation referred to as Canada. And as such, we see the Canadian women's hockey team reach the pinnacle of achievement in their sport. Must we not make the intentional action towards understanding our relationship to the Indigenous peoples that occupy the same, that we can be renamed and claimed as our own? Another story. I'm in Queen Charlotte. Haida Gwaii. Well, not exactly. At the time, my work had taken me to the Queen Charlotte Islands, not yet returned, echoing with the residue of colonialization that formed this place called Canada and erased its first peoples. I'm walking along the road by the harbor, lost in thought. I happen to look in the water below. Dolphins are following me. Seemingly, my eyes open and begin to see, really see. All around me is that life coded into a living history of this place and these peoples that I walk amongst. Eagle, raven, they are all coming to life. Haida Gwaii is a magical place, but also a place that is not of Canada. At least that's my belief. It is the first place I've been where I knew I was a guest, invited in for a short time, but this was Haida land. Their ancestors still present, a sense of a people alive. This was over 20 years ago now, and being out on the West Coast was formative in framing of my understanding of our relationship to Canada and to the Indigenous peoples whose land we occupy now. The realization that the treaties and the formal recognition of other nations are within the bounds of Canada and continue to remain unsettled and disputed and unresolved to this day. So when we seek to determine what equitable practice is, I do so with a colonized mind, yet that is incomplete as it denotes a willingness to participate in complicity in the ongoing colonization. It is in this frame that I broach the subject of land acknowledgements with the climate of social justice and reconciliation. I feel at a loss to attempt yet again to draw attention to notions of colonialism that permeate every facet of our existence in these places on this land. Without hesitation, I begin today with a humble assertion that the unceded lands, including the entire Western Hemisphere and numerous regions around the world, were forcibly taken from First Peoples through violence, coercion, and other forms of misappropriation, and to attest to the vibrancy of those nations, cultures, and peoples that are alive and present here today. Does committing to a perfunctory and perhaps performative acknowledgement do the work that land acknowledgements were designed to accomplish? Do we now remove them because they are becoming fixed in times as needed without a commitment to actual change for those communities that are still suffering? And what about the vibrance of those cultures, those nations that are not gone, not lesser than? They exist within the same temporal, social, political sphere that I occupy right now. But in my lack, I remain disconnected from those peoples that I should be sharing space with, communing with, and more actively striving together towards real change. And even by doing this small action, recognize that the privilege that I enjoy to speak to you today in comfort from a place of respect and learning and thoughtful provocation with a historical weight that I put down in order to interrogate the meanings it has for me today. Yet I also need to situate my discussion of my connection to this land as that of one that is fraught, and my ancestral connection to Blackness and Africanness severed early on, disrupting my relationship to my being Black in an occupying structure that disenfranchised with the same intention that I was brought forth and my ancestors were forced to serve. And in using the words of George Day, my Blackness has come to mean a sense of being out of place, of not belonging, given that Black and African peoples are continually asked to validate, legitimize our existence on this land, paradoxically a stolen land. The delegitimization of Black and African bodies is connected to and perpetuates the Black and African erasure in the Canadian imaginary. But I also am mindful of how the stories we tell can further colonial imperial projects. We can find ourselves implicated not only in the system of colonialization and domination, but also in the practices of anti-Blackness and anti-Black racisms. There is a critical discussion that we tend to shy away from, that participating in the structures and ideologies of dominant and oppressive power do not concede complicity by default. Thus, we must all continue to form understandings based on our positionality at present, and also to account for our past, and for me, the privileges that I hold and not have used to the effect that is possible. It is to reconcile the past in this place, as we refer to as Canada, and the legacy of the past that did not honor or value my presence. And what does that do for me today? As such, the context becomes vital. The historiography of Canada remains separate yet aligned with the notions of race and racializations in the America. But why note the difference? As Dr. Christopher Taylor posits, contrary to popular belief, Canada did not adopt the insidious anti-Black racism from the United States. The Canadian discrimination of Blacks was a product of the British ideals and a liberal racial order. The diachronic and geographical transfer of racialized ideals and anti-Black sentiment from the 17th century British West Indian slave codes the early 20th century Canadian immigration policy was not entirely a linear historical product, but an ideology that existed throughout the Black Atlantic and Western political thought since the biblical fact of the curse of Ham. The sons of Ham were misinterpreted to be sub-Saharan or Black Africans. We have to understand our institutions within the context of when and how they were formed. That legacy persists, even if we decide to restory it to be otherwise. So why the preamble, you might ask? Isn't this a discussion about sport and equity? True, but for me and my research, there is no place that is offered that does not bring my entire truth and politic into the light. It is vital in the interrogation of those experiences of racialized persons in sport to be challenged not by the structures that support these activities that are moving, but rather the legacy and baggage that comes along for the ride. I've been asked to, comment on attitudes towards sport to the effect that it is not political. And I argue that by its very existence in our society, sport is political. In fact, sport embodies our politic. It remains an expression of our intentions, theorizations, idealizations, fantasy, worship, and conversely shortcomings. Sport stands on shifting sands where we cling to notions of its solidity and fixity, and perhaps a resolve to keep sport as just sport. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, both past and present. I began my journey as an accredited academic recently. In fact, It was a short pause before the storm of 2020. But coming to scholarship later in life affords a certain perspective that perhaps those who enter these conventions at a younger age have not yet engaged in. It is not that having 20 plus years of professional experience offers deeper insights into theoretical territory that academics use to frame these discussions. It is more the understanding of how lived experience shapes understandings about the same things we tend to be understood from only one perspective. An outsider looking in as an academic with valuable insights into what was missing, but often lacking the reality that is present for those involved within those projects. Such that it is, my scholarship, and more aptly my practice, has been formed by a criticality that is only less understood as I move through the world. Not that it was unformed or not present, and it features heavily on how I understood those things that I choose to research today. How I found myself here today looking at notions of diversity, equity, inclusion, race, colonialism, decolonialism, and decoloniality. But to begin, why did I choose to study the sport of curling? The story begins with a friend connected to a sport. And perhaps that is as important as anything else, because our first understandings of how we participate in sport are usually those primary relationships. In this case, after a few beers, I was invited to join a bonspiel, but this was no ordinary bonspiel. And for those not in the know, a bonspiel is a fancy curling term for a tournament. But in this case, it was actually a pro-am bonspiel, and there were representatives from professional teams all around the world. They were coming to this place to both celebrate the end of the season and also to have a fun, enjoying time. As I walked into the Toronto Cricket Club, it was an interesting dynamic that was happening. At the time, I was the only Black person within the space. And moving and going through all of these social organizations or arrangements, I still had to contend with those facts. At the same time, out on the cricket pitch, there was a group of men of South Asian descent that were playing, but not yet invited into the structure of the curling club. So I reflect back on that as a really interesting time. And it has informed why I decided to go down this road and interrogate what is happening within the world of curling, that you can have these special moments with amazing people from all around the world coming together, yet not have a representation that looks like what we call Canada today. And it's in those lights that I decided to say, instead of taking a look at what racialized persons feel, think, and be within that space, of actually going and asking those of the dominant cultures, what are your thoughts on the subject? And the findings, I came up with a number of grand narratives that curling tells itself about itself. Things like gentlemanly and fair play come to mind, which form one of these dominant narratives of curling's Victorian legacy. And in fact, we need to recognize that the legacy within sport is not a present day feature and traditions held onto for effect, but rather that they are informed by a legacy coming from different eras, different values, and perhaps those are what we need to challenge. But curling also presents this great social connection. I have never experienced a sport that is more, in fact, social, where you have the winners of a particular game buying the losers a round of drinks. It also has a very strong connection to a grassroots identity. in fact, not just a grassroots, but also a blue collar of class-based, lower class intentions to recreate, belong, and form communities in small, particularly small communities across Canada and throughout the world. And it is this identity that they rely on, even within the construction of curling clubs within a country club setting. One of the most important narratives that still rings true today, and even though that Canadians are struggling in the Olympics within curling, it is really this unrecognized other national sport where it's quintessentially Canadian to curl, and what that means, bringing up images of the winter, of throwing rocks on a frozen pond. And again, these connections deeply engaged in what we consider the land that is Canada. Finally, one of the important grand narratives that is contained within curling represents this opportunity to engage in notions of diversity. As participation levels start to wane, there are these untapped peoples that can now be drawn into the sport. So not just as a social good, but as a financial driver to keep the sport vibrant and alive today. Throughout that research, however, there were some other counter narratives that started to emerge. Even though that I went into these situations and these interviews with full knowledge that what I was actually trying to investigate revolved around notions of diversity, there was a reluctance to engage in conversations about race and also the role of whiteness within the sport. A caveat that curlers, in as far as I have had connections with, are very well aware of the situation that there are not a large percentage of racialized persons that are participating in the sport. However, there is a lack of perhaps understanding about why those conditions continue to persist today. And finally, one of the last counter narratives that I found was around the silence and lack of discussion around indigeneity and the relationship to curling to the indigenous peoples. And this is especially important when you start to consider that the spread of small curling clubs, particularly in West and through the prairie provinces, was so prevalent, and yet have a lack of connection, awareness, and also reconciliation with the peoples and the lands that those curling clubs now occupy. So from my perspective of taking a look at what that research project brought to bear was these deeper considerations and understanding as of what our colonial legacy means within the confines of sport, the traditions and symbology that actually are present even within the curling club itself. Those things tend to go unnoticed and in fact taken as a norm or matter of fact, and yet can potentially create barriers for participation for those peoples who are not present. One of my friends who I've met on this journey recounts some of his experiences coming into the curling club of being less than favorable, and having racist epithets sent his way in multiple forms. And to me, that speaks to a certain indication that while perhaps this is a sport that needs to have an interrogation of what it is and where it's going into the future. I think there's an examination that we have to do throughout sport and the relationship of Canada to those institutions and support structures that support them. And what does that mean for us moving forward? So moving forward from this one singular event that struck me with not only a passion to understand this sport, but also some critical questions about why the representation of racialized persons is not increasing within a sport, led me down this road, coming from those questions of why I am still having to wear whites in the tennis world. There are still these deep fundamental questions we need to ask each other, and that leads me into my research of today. My project at Ryerson University, and I will say Ryerson in quotes because as Ryerson goes through a name change that is critical to these conversations that we're having about reconciliation, we have to make note not only of the research that we do, but also the conversations that we're having around the institutions that support that style of research and what that research really entails. The current research project that I'm working on and continue to work on today started with 32 interviews of racialized and persons that identify as belonging to marginalized communities. From there was a number of interviews that was not only focused on the experience of those persons in sport, but also the relationship they have to sport moving forward in their professional and professional careers. What it's done to inform not only positively, but perhaps negatively as well. What are those experiences that they want to carry forward and those which actually have detracted from the significance of sport within their lives and perhaps the parallels that they find within their professional careers. Now, the research was undertaken under COVID conditions, so of course, the insights reflect a lot of that discussion. And it's really important that we start to recognize that the lasting impact of COVID and the restrictions that have curtailed our activities will have lasting effects beyond just reopening and removing the restrictions and hoping that everything will go back to normal. One of the most important insights that people who I interviewed were talking about was, well, in fact, will I return? Is dropping out and not being part of that social fabric just as vital to me because I need to attend to other things? I need to attend to my mental health. Those were definite considerations as we move through. On the personal side, there was a number of participants that were really suffering, that had said that the lack of sport and in fact the lack of engagement on a social was a critical factor in where they found themselves today. Overall, this discussion was framed within the era that we were living in today. The interviews started at the end of the summer in 2020, and so the discourse around the killing and murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor was top of mind with the global outcry for Black Lives Matter and the protests that ensued. Overall, out of those 32 interviews, not one person had not either personally or directly related to a personal friend experienced either racism or forms of discrimination. And to me, that was a shocking revelation. Not surprising, but still, it was there. I think that when we look forward and thinking about that intersection, the intersection of different social identity constructions, we have to remember that the privilege that certain groups hold have to be then countered with understanding that the experiences within racial groups are not uniform. And in fact, they intersect along a number of different subjectivities. So going down those lines and seeing the effects on Black and racialized women, different sexual or gender identities, all of these things lead us into very deep questions about what does inclusion actually look like within these spaces. Within the competitive streams, there was a tendency to want to get back to play, to want to get back into those. But the experiences were no different. There was still forms of racial discrimination and racism felt by many of the people that were there. Discrimination within the locker rooms, discrimination that was happening outside within the cultures that are supporting sport and those institutions that have those constructions. There is a lack of representation throughout this discourse. And because of that, the leadership, the coaching, the administration, and moving up, particularly in the professional ranks, was lacking. And feelings from the participants were that they weren't being heard, that their value and their experiences were not being taken seriously. And there is an interesting phenomenon that was happening in talking to many of these people. Now, I situated the research in the Canadian context. However, there were people that responded who actually had come from the United States, but now reside in Canada and had gone through both the American and Canadian sports systems. And there was a lot of discussion around the form of Canadian racism and what it looks like and how it manifests. And to me, there was an interesting consideration that perhaps Canada, sitting on its laurels, saying that we're not as racist, touting aspects of multiculturalism and racial tolerance, is perhaps needing to be interrogated in different ways, as we see often today. For example, I feel like Canada almost tries to hide behind, like, yes, we are Canada. We're not the States. We're multicultural. We believe in diversity. But Canada, I find that racism is more or less swept under the rug type of approach. And things where it's like, it's just there. So I think as we reflect back on the role of diversity, again, it's really, what is the starting point? What is our understanding of the forms of discrimination that people who are trying to be included, or if we are trying to design equitable practices to help those people feel like they more belong or are welcomed within a particular sport environment, we need to have these honest conversations about what forms of discrimination they're actually feeling, and are they the ones that have to shoulder the burden of proof and the actions that need to happen around that. One of the other important takeaways from the study was the role of the sport industry within notions of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And of course, the roles of professional athletes was very important in that conversation, again, led by the WNBA, bringing to light some of the issues around, the treatment of policing for Black communities, particularly within the United States, but also here in Canada. And many of the participants were both optimistic at the time, but also skeptical that anything would happen. It was a hurry up and wait and see type of mentality to approach these kinds of questions. And will the actions be performative, or will they actually really yield results? Some of the things that I would like to, further study and have inform this next phase of the research are, there was a lot of conversation around the ideas of separation or having exclusive forms of activity. And you can see this most notably within my world of curling in gay and lesbian leagues that are supporting the LGBTQ2S+ community. And it wasn't necessarily a sense of being excluded from curling as a whole, but having those safe spaces to feel like they can actually truly be themselves and belong. And talking with some other senior leadership within the soccer world, and their revelations of thinking about Black only or racialized only leagues, to help foster a sense of belonging before integration within wider sports. And on the surface, it seems to be, well, isn't that going backward in time? Isn't that going back into these areas of exclusion that we had seen before? Perhaps and perhaps not. And there are real considerations that need to be had around what constitutes inclusion in these circumstances. And in fact, is the more equitable practice to actually be excluded from these dominant cultures that tend to have aspects of discriminatory or behaviors unbecoming of the sport that they're supposed to support. Because it was a COVID time, program delivery is really important. And this is where we get into these conversations of what constitutes inclusion. When we're trying to design new practices and new activities that are really trying to foster a different sense of what sport can be, what it can be for everyone, and what does that sport have to look like to have these multiple worldviews come together as one. And this is the further extension of what my research is now trying to look at, is from the design to the execution, how do we look at the role of inclusion, whose voices are heard, whose aren't available? How do we create space for those people not only to come into the conversation, but in the perfect world, is there truly a form of inclusion that can incorporate everyone into the conversation? There are questions to be asked, and there's questions to be asked with sport. What is the role of governance within this? Where are those people that say that EDI is such an important thing, yet are not offering those resources to make sure that those activities manifest in the ways that they should? And finally, I think one of the most revelatory insights that I have from this phase of the study was the overarching idea about not only excellence, but that sport breeds resilience. And on the surface, that seems like an important factor, that going into communities that have potentially been disenfranchised or marginalized or underserviced in many ways, that the skills that you want to instill within participants is a sense of resilience. But what it does mask is the fact that why do they have to be resilient? And asking questions of the support systems that support them, why is there a need to develop a certain resilience? Wouldn't it be better to interrogate what the responses are, why these situations and experiences are still occurring, and also to construct spaces where discussions around those experiences can actually have fruitful, emotional, and healing outcomes, rather than be strong, continue on the status quo as it is. So I'm going to finish off today with talking a little bit about a so what. And every talk must end, but this is a vital space. I want to extend my appreciation to Mount Royal University Library to allowing me to speak today. These types of venues for dialogue must be fostered and maintained as a means of disruption, engagement, contemplation, and discourse. If we were to imagine another possibility, another world in which our individual and collective values are honored, discussion is one vehicle towards that lofty goal. I am strangely optimistic, regardless of my overly negative leanings, often seemingly to be angry, dismissal, or perhaps simply arrogant. For me, I consider my part in all of this. What truths I must unravel to become something different in this space. It is in the process of unlearning and relearning that I find purpose. It is a singular journey of sorts. Again, I recognize from where I speak in the privilege that I hold, yet it waxes and wanes depending on the situation and conditions I am offered and the environments that I occupy. Words are power, and in speaking on these complex issues, the language that we use is even more critical. We often look through terms as interchangeable to an end that has become increasingly fixed, and there is a danger in that. As Sarah Ahmed stated, the repetition of terms is necessary because such terms fail to act. At the same time, such terms fail to act because they are repeated. In the repetition of the term is, in a way, the repetition of failure. We say the term because it is failed, and it fails because we say it. The circularity of this loop is what produces the tiredness of the term. The term slows down or gets weighed down by acquiring too much baggage, which produces a kind of gut resistance. They are sick of it. As such, we must be vigilant in these spaces and continually challenge the tensions that remain fixed within a form of action, as the words become symbols rather than the active shifts that they imply. For me, this is why I gravitate towards story. As with traditions within oral histories, the story does not remain the same. Rather, it responds to the contextual, relational, and social landscape and to the peoples that are representing it. The story morphs and responds and travels and comes yet again into being over and over again. I speak of sport, I speak of my life in sport. I speak of my experience that shaped my understanding of sport. I often feel my true calling is that of a narrator, to offer a bit of direction, not expert, but interpreter of what lies in front of me and what lies in front of all of us. In speaking to you all today, I hope that I bring something to the topic and leaving you all not with solutions, but rather framing more questions. I appreciate you all. Peace.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions. Folks, feel free to raise your hands or type it in the chat. I know that was a lot of information to take in, so you might need a moment to sort of collect your thoughts. Dr. Norman, forgive me if I missed this, but the participants that you interviewed, were they mostly professional athletes, or did they come from the recreational sphere at all? I'm just
It
interested.
was a wide range,
Okay.
all the way from student athletes to the C-suite, professional. Yeah, it was a wide range of people, and I mean, the commonality is either they were racialized or they belong to communities that have been pushed to the margins in our society.
That's really interesting to know that regardless of sort of what area they're coming from, that's the common bond that they share. And it's really unfortunate to hear as well. Do we have any questions in the audience? I know we have a number of folks here from the recreation department. We have a few folks from health and physical education, folks from the libraries, and folks from outside of Mount Royal University. Thank you so much for joining us. We have about 15 minutes here, so don't hold back. All right, Leslie, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Norman. I really enjoyed your conversation. And I have to say, I was kind of chuckling. And the reason I was chuckling is that when you were talking about your curling experience, I was thinking about my experience with golfing, because I was an avid golfer as a young child. And it was an interesting dynamic when I got on the course, because at that time, not that I'm going to say how old I am, but at that time I was kind of an anomaly, and my dad definitely was an anomaly, because as a Black Canadian, it was an interesting dynamic. Was it eye-opening? It actually was a safe place, but I'm wondering now, was it a safe place because I didn't know any better? And that was I looking for that disconnect or the looks, or was I not? And I often ask myself now, why or why not was I, impacted by that? I think now I was impacted by it, but then maybe I wasn't. And it's interesting how you look back on your experiences with a different lens because of your experiences. And so I look back at that and I think of it differently now. And just your conversation about curling, about tennis, just resonated for me. And so I thank you for taking me back to those times and taking me back to a very special time with my father, who's no longer here. So thank you. And it's all about story. That's all we are, a story.
Well, thanks, Leslie. Appreciate you sharing with. I think it's really important to reflect back on those experiences. And I won't say that the last couple of years have been easy in reflecting back on those kinds of situations, not only in sport, but also in my professional career, because you begin to recognize, at least for myself, those times when I couldn't fully be myself. I couldn't fully, express who I am. And what does that mean? To not want to be the personification of the angry black man within the meeting, to take up space, to hide, to not stand up, to not even walk, as tall as you are through the hallways, and remembering those times, and also remembering, that's the funny thing about sport. I mean, sport for me has been a constant. There have been so many positive experiences that I've had, yet they do come at a cost. I think that when I reflect back at it now, partly because I'm studying it all the time, the costs are a lot higher, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience I've had in sport weren't, they formed some of the, the lasting friendships that I have today. So I think it's important to then look back and also contextualize it based on the historical, time that it actually happened. These conversations weren't as prevalent. Not that people weren't advocating against discrimination, racial or otherwise, back in those times, but was that the order of the day? I grew up in the Trudeau era. I'm showing my age a little bit now. It's all multiculturalism and racial tolerance, and everything's great. So I believe that. I believe in that myth and that fantasy for such a long time. And but the cracks started to show, and that's, I think, what brings me here today.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm curious if you have any ideas on how we can create opportunities to engage with our own athletes in that here on campus and in the Calgary community, to be able to create those safe spaces that you talked about, or at least recognize if there is a need for that. How do we open up these conversations in our communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there needs to be a very intentional approach to doing a lot of these kinds of things. And the more that I sort of wade into this, I realize how deep the water is. When you're trying to create safe sport and inclusive, activities, there is no perfect in this. To be able to hold space for everyone and their multiple identities to freely express everything means really reforming the way that our social bonds and the arrangements that we have in broader life come to bear. And then, so I think that there's steps that we can take to get there. One of them is being really intentional with who's ringing around the table, what kinds of conversations, and also the ability to ask those harder questions with real sources of action that come out of it, and not to be afraid of those questions. I mean, the learning that I've had to do, from 2020 or even prior to that, we take a look at the Me Too movement and all the things that has brought to bear, looking at the role of, women in sport, gender issues, all those kinds of things, the idea of complaint, the idea of, proof of allegations. Those things are now under a different type of interrogation that we haven't had, well, I hope that we have in some sports, but in most sports we haven't had. So to the formation of independent bodies that are really going to take a look at how do we keep everybody accountable, not just governing bodies, but also, different levels, grassroots level. So even when you take a look at the institution that you're in today, it's huge. It has lots of structures in there, and I think that it's really taking those structures and putting them under scrutiny and saying, we're not perfect in this. We have to start. We have to make sure that we're moving towards a different kind of goal and setting what that goal is, what those values really mean for any of those structures that are supporting sport, whether it be recreational, whether it be the student athletes, whether it be any different types of subjectivity, not just race and gender, which tend to get high profile, but different ability, and down the line.
Yeah, and speaking of ability, David Lake, who has spoken in the past on ability in sports, has a question for us.
Well, me, like, full disclosure, Richard and I do a fair bit of work together, actually. But Richard, how do you build beyond some of these initiatives so that it's not just lip service, it's not tokenism, and so that there's real change? And so, the commercials that are on television, for instance, from my perspective, during the Olympics, that are showing athletes with a disability and able-bodied athletes, is a great first step. But what I want to know is, how do you, from a disability perspective, as it might relate to diversity and marginalized populations, but how do you move beyond that to ensure that the change? And I'm thinking even, here on campus, and so we're not just checking boxes. And again, you may have addressed this earlier, and I'm sorry I was late to your presentation, but how do you ensure that it's real change and it's not just checkbox and tokenism?
Yeah. Thanks, David. Of course, you'd put me on the spot for something like that, eh? Yeah, it's look, I think in a certain way that's the $1 million question. I mean, everybody within different systems in sport are asking, okay, what are those 10 things that we can do that are really going to make change? And I think that one of the things that I'm coming back to is the role of systems within this conversation, that these systems are already under threat. And the thing is, if you have to take a look at them, it's not just, oh, here's a new thing that we're going to add on to it and really hope that everything is going to shift. The thing is, there's a cumulative effect of doing things over and over again from multiple different points of view. And what pressures and tensions does that actually, what does that mean for the system? And then the system starts to unravel. It starts to actually fracture and break and move, and has to be then reconstituted. So I think that, continually doing all these different things, like what the HDA is, like what the Black Girls Hockey Club represents, what Paralympians are doing, it's all really important, because what it does is starts to expose and starts to create more and more friction and tension within the system, to a point where it has to then reconstitute. And I think that's the opportunity, which is, let's make sure that it starts to unravel enough that we can, really actively then say, we're going to pick up these pieces and we have to reform them. And from my perspective, it starts at the very top, which is, what is the role of Sport Canada? What is the role of federal government? What are the roles, all the way down, and then from the grassroots up, because that's where the expressions of more full, more inclusive entities are going to come from, and those coming together. But there's going to be lots of resistance, and I think that's the challenge for us all. That's the thing that speaks to the frustration and the pessimism and all those other things that come along. So I mean, I think it's really beholden on us to really put the system under threat and under tension, to make sure that things start to, we really have to shift. And I think that's what's happening today. So I hope that continues. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question. It's rambling.
No. And listen, thank you for doing this today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. We do have one question in the chat. Daniela has asked, how can we be part of the conversation when our background is diverse? The feedback we may sometimes receive is that we do not have the same shared experiences as others, and therefore we simply do not understand the challenges.
Yeah, that is I mean, I hear this a lot. And I think from my perspective, you have to remember, even with the way that I construct my talk, it's from me. This is my take on what it even means to be racialized within Canada. And I'm not speaking for all Black communities, across Canada and throughout the world. It's my interpretation of what it means to be racialized within our society. And I think that is the sharing that can happen in any circumstance. So, one of these things, one of the areas that always comes under threat is like, oh, I'm an ally. What do I do? How do I support you? Well, part of that is having a compassionate, understanding that there's trauma here, there's healing that has to happen, there's frustration of moving this forward. If you're willing to go along that ride, then as you're starting to develop relationships with the people that are involved, and that is, for me, first and foremost, is extending yourself out into these uncomfortable situations means that, yeah, you have to take a step. I have to forge a relationship with, the indigenous communities in Toronto, because this is their land. So how do I do that? And, I think that if you're not in that particular, quote unquote subjectivity, or the, whatever group you decide to be in, it's really about extending yourself into those in a very respectful and humble way. But you have to bring your own experiences and stories into that conversation. Otherwise, then it's really, you're always asking those people to hold the mantle of the change that you're trying to all work towards. So it's an active role that you have to extend yourself. And I think, it's a commitment to being, perhaps a little bit uncomfortable as you move forward.
Great. We have time for one last question. Kristen has her hand up.
Hi. I just first off wanted to say thank you so much for speaking today. It was really nourishing for me as a, I guess, very young academic and professional in recreation. And it was really igniting to think about these things once again. My one largest question for you right now is, within sport and recreation, it's often founded on systems of racism, ableism, sexism, genderism, etc. In your mind, maybe very far off in the future, how do you see us navigating and moving beyond the continuous microaggressions and harm that is perpetuated sometimes from those systems that still go uninterrogated?
Well, wow, that is a question. Thank you so much. I have to, there are so many different things that come to mind. If we start to take a look at the future conditions, I think that is, even in and of itself, an important step. Because one of the issues that I come out, and I do consulting within sort of anti-racism and decolonization, we don't know where we're actually headed. And so what does that perfect state even look like is a challenge for us to even entertain, where there is not microaggressions happening, where there is not a toxic, culture that supports the structures that we're actually delivering activities through, that the activities themselves have, tenets of safety go beyond where we are today. So, I am a big, part of my bio is all about futurism, but using things like Afrofuturism and Indigenous futures to imagine peoples in different states of being is actually an important step. And I think that we can do that in sport. At least that's what I'm theorizing for my research, right? Is that if we use those kinds of techniques to imagine states of being, then we have better targets, or at least we can see, if we have a set of these, which one are we trending towards, and actually make conscious steps to actually mitigate risk that we're not doing what we're supposed to doing, or also, adding more resources and more emphasis on those areas that are actually, responding to the kinds of ideas that we're thinking about. To really dismantle the structures that are in place, I think it's to put them under threat first, which is exactly what you're doing. You're calling them out and saying, you are supporting these environments that make me and others feel very uncomfortable, and don't allow them to have the experience that you say is enshrined in the mission, and vision of what this is. And that's the problem with sport. Sport by definition says that it's open to everybody. That is the default, yet we know that it's not. So what are we trying to live up to? And I think it's taking those realistic views and interrogating what messaging are we really trying to get out there, and crafting a new narrative, which I think can be inclusive and have this pluralistic viewpoint. Like, we're very Western centric, we're very Canadian centric in all our approaches. What happens when we involve other forms? Like, somebody who comes from another place has a very different understanding of what the world is. So, as an academic, I think you need to pick, what you want to, your area of interest, and be passionate about that. I mean, that's why I even came back into academia, and that's a whole other story. I can tell David later, but, like, to be here is because I think that this is a purpose-driven way that we can approach and get to a different place in sport and also in our society.